Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all to all the presenters, and of course for including us. I'm Laura Metzler, not moderating with Nada Reza. So, I mean, to kind of, I guess, start off the thoughts, I'm a little bit contextualizing with kind of the first session where we were talking a lot about these kind of personal experiences and like the telling, they had brought up the idea of like telling the stories that are in the walls. What I saw as a big commonality in this is rather that these very kind of intimate experiences, we're talking a lot about like much larger kind of choreographing of bodies and kind of the creation of narratives through the bodies and the kind of the building of these narratives, whether on like a national level or a historical level, and also like the agency then and Mo's beautiful performance of this intentionality of and power of even smaller kind of actions of the body and the ability to transfer it. So I kind of wanted to see if there are any kind of responses to this idea of choreography in different ways and in your very different practices, and how you're kind of using the body and choreography as like a mechanism in different ways.
It's an open question. So
yeah, open question
whoever
for
wants to speak
kind
first.
of anyone. Yeah.
Okay, I guess I'll start. I think in the format of the presentation that I gave today, like my physical body, the performing body, was kind of in contrast to the character that I was narrating. So just considerations of that kind of tension between what is performed, what is enacted, that is something that I considered with the work. I mean, in terms of like a kind of queering of the character, because, I mean, I was speaking on behalf of a fictional male Urdu poet, so that is clearly not the case. And then also in terms of speaking of the body in relation to the metaphors that I used of light, of landscape, of land, of flora, bodily sensations. It's all kind of embedded into this larger narrative of nuclear nationalism. And once this kind of the performativity of nationalism, what are the implications of that? So both enacting and then also a kind of what are the traces of that enactment? That was kind of the way I was looking at the body as like a mechanism.
Anybody else? I wondered if Mo or Qasim, you want to pick up
I'd
on
like
that?
to.
Great.
So I think in terms of choreographing and stringing together different actors and staging, I think that there's something definitely there in our work, and we're looking at it also from the standpoint of the medium itself, like using rendering or video game or virtual reality in order to re-narrate these histories, as is being done in the case of Hezbollah, or as is done by the case of the US Army, and especially in the case of Hezbollah, like re-narrating an entire war from a certain, and highlighting specific episodes in that game where there's certain battles being fought. And so yeah, like pushing that medium into not just rendering buildings, but also rendering these players. And I think what we tried to do with the visuals was we tried to take apart these games themselves and like reanimate them in a way, so to bring them to make them perform as zombies, or like, so we kind of took assets from them, like took characters, certain footages, and tried to put them together. And there was a shot that we missed. I wish we could have played it. It's at the end. But there's this view taken from the VR, virtual reality of the US Army. And there's close-ups on like these virtual citizens in the Arab village. And there's close-ups of like people in hijab, people moving around. And it's a very eerie, I wish we could have played it. It's the last 10 seconds from the video. But yeah, and I feel like in terms of choreography, that is something we try to do on the medium, but also in terms of the examined case studies.
And I thought it was interesting to have also this kind of tension across the presenters of like the good and the evil, the hero and the demon. I mean, also like the stories that we're supposed to tell and that we tell ourselves so that we can kind of sleep, but then also the stories that like you're not supposed to tell that have been kind of disappeared. So like in terms of choreography and Alexis's work, this like planned intention movement, but also these stories of these kind of disappeared areas, you know, on top of like then these stories that Hezbollah are telling in this video, in these video games, and that also then, you know, like the U.S. in terms of, you know, PTSD and trying to like come to terms with it. I found these kind of tensions quite interesting across the presentations. I mean, do we want to maybe Khadim or Alexis sort of talk about this kind of the good and evil or the choreography of these kind of bodies or presentations? I don't know if you have anything to say.
Well, in this work, for me, in Phantom Sun, in terms of representation of bodies, the choice has been to
remove them entirely.
To remove them entirely, exactly. And that's been very much one of the guiding principles of getting this work together. So it is very much collected materials over a few years and many trips to a specific area. And yeah, so this, I mean, the empty shots were kind of were sort of were the ones that stuck together.
Yeah, of course.
For this work. So it was really like a kind of a sort of post-human world, I guess, that I was interested in depicting. Whereas all the landscapes are fundamentally altered and sort of acted upon by humans, but yet no humans are to be seen. So that was very much the guiding principle for me for that work.
So, about my work and the choreography. So, like some people ask me, Mozart, do you have the dancing background or not? Yeah, actually, I'm not, because that what I did in 11 years ago. So at that time, I was like, before that, most of my pieces I use a lot of material, and then dealing with some social issue and politics. At that time, I just want to be away from that. So no issue and just only what, no material, how only the body can do that. Yeah? And yeah, at that time I was like, I got the long hair. I didn't cut my hair 8 years, so my hair is like that. And then one day my sister came back from the States, and then she want to make like a family gathering. So my family is Buddhist, so that's why they want me to be like a monk, for a while. But I don't want to cut my hair. But is it kind of the social gathering? So I cut my hair, and then when I cut my hair, when I see my face in front of the mirror, it's really strange for me. I never see the face because 8 years I didn't cut. Yeah, and then when I put my hand on that, wow, that's good. Yeah, because I can only focus the hand and face. So how can I develop the piece? So, and I got the residency in Malaysia. It's called Rimbun Hands for 2-month residency. And yeah, as a performer artist, I don't know how to spend the residency time. So that's why I try to find the combination of face and finger every day, like sometimes 5 position and sometimes 10 position. So like walking among like 1 month, I found 108 position. So it's like sometimes like I just try to push myself over the 100% or something like that, yeah. And also 108 is kind of like in the Buddhism is like kind of infinity, and yeah. So some position have a meaning, some have no meaning. So try to combine with that, and also like the audience can be interpreted with from their background, and also I try to be interact with the audience, so not really follow with the step by step, yeah. So
I guess I'd like to push the question that Laura was asking a bit further, because one of the words that kept, or the kind of themes that kept coming up in the presentations were alienation, dehumanization, the disembodied, the dehumanized, right? And I guess I wondered for each of you how much the relationship of technology in being able to kind of tell that narrative and kind of express the anxieties associated with the idea of othering through technology, and through, I suppose, I guess most of the presentations, of course, the archetypes of good and evil was very much present, but the thing that we are all dealing with is how to tell the stories of violence without violence itself, right? What happens to the body at those sites of violence? And I think each of you had really interesting ways of dealing with that problem indirectly. And I wondered if you could talk about why these strategies appeal.
I guess I should start about that. Yeah. I recently went to Afghanistan and then collected some of the propaganda songs from the Taliban, and then into the and so wanted to take the work into the sound pieces, and then going beyond the imageries and collect those sounds, and also collect the sounds of the people who were affected by the Taliban in Afghanistan, and then to do something with those sounds without getting into the imageries. Also, because imageries has some issues with their faith and religion in Afghanistan, so I think that would be taking it to a little bit milder to exhibit it in Afghanistan. Yeah.
I guess our point of departure was to see how rituals could themselves cease to get dependent on the human body to be reenacted. And this is why we went into the architectural rendering of a specific ritual, and in this case, the digital rendering of a ritual performance, which itself led us to sort of questions the aesthetics being deployed and the ways through which rendering itself was sort of reproducing aesthetic violence. In the case of the US Army, for instance, the ways through which generic Arab or Afghan civilians were being portrayed. And then we found a very interesting term coined by a media theorist. It's generic realism, which basically sort of shows the processes of othering that occur when there's a mass reproduction of this sort of very generic form of Arabness or Afghanness, which sort of not only dehumanizes but sort of transforms these human props into actual targets. And even the landscape itself ceases to become a site but a target in and of itself, because it's completely stripped of any sort of particularities, any sort of signifiers that constitute its own place and space. So yeah. Do you want to add anything, Basim?
Yeah, and we were kind of looking at how, because like there's a theme which it relates to the othering, which is like how forces like Hezbollah posit themselves as counter-hegemons. So, and then like that appeal towards visualization and virtual reality is sort of a way to like counteract what they see as the hegemony of the US through them, through these forms of entertainment. But then, of course, the counter-hegemony is in itself violent, and that was sort of what, like, in terms of the visuals, that was sort of what we were trying to do, to like sort of like put them all on the same plane and try to mess with them all together. And I'd like to thank like one of our friends, Bahar Nourizadeh. Her work sometimes, in terms of the video interlacing, there's some inspiration going on there. And yeah, I feel like that is the tactic we tried to play, like to really like reanimate those appeals towards representation and those appeals towards not being the other, but that are sometimes in themselves end up being also dominant and hegemonic.
I think in regards to your question of technology, I think my project is looking at two aspects within technology. So one aspect is the prominence of the color green, as you could see, but referring specifically to the green screen as a space for projection, but then green as in uranium as well, as in Pakistani nationalism, as military. as landscape, as all these things encapsulated. So in a way, a referent to technology is being inverted through the narrative, this folding and unfolding of referring to a green that's ephemeral, and then the body can consume and it can also project outward. And then another aspect of looking at technology, or like the form of dissemination of information. So looking at the internet as archive. So the onset of the project actually happened due to the lack of information around Chagi Monument Hill online. And then it's all these like remnants and rumors around the appearance and disappearance of the monument. And through these images that I have added to the animation and presentation. So in a way, the kind of replication of the appearance, disappearance, the moments of the blast are all obscured, both within the digital realm and on site. So using these mechanisms and the tone, I guess, within technology is just kind of being pushed against itself in the project.
I guess, Amber, just to ask you, a more specific question. This idea of the Sufi divine or divine love and the way that you, I guess, quite playfully, but also quite seriously deal with this conflation of nationalism. I think, Basim, you guys called it ethno-religious nationalism. And I guess, that there is a kind of generational indoctrination, let's say, that you're hinting at, that is perhaps obscure to the wider world, but definitely through the internet is being disseminated. And I guess if you could talk more about that idea of love and attraction within that.
I'm not so sure that it has to do in specific to a kind of generational distinction, but it's just another platform for which the state can kind of propagate. And so the internet is such a platform. So a lot of the material that I had gathered are from like Facebook nationalist groups about and memes around this moment of Yom Takbir. And there's ways in which this divinity that is being spoken of is subsumed into kind of state logic and then reproduced and then disseminated and scattered. So somehow embedded in all of this meme culture is state propaganda. And like what are the ways in which you can trace that, right? And I think the project seeks to do that, to accumulate all these moments in somewhat of a disjunctive narrative, which is inherent in the material, and then try to make sense of it, or not, or like own up to the fact that this is not making sense.
I guess I have a specific question for Khadim as well, and I guess I should be honest here that his is a practice that I have followed for a very long time, and it's been interesting to see how the relationship with the kind of Hazara diaspora for you has now become important, whereas it was once a proximity, being in Pakistan, having access to Afghanistan, and now being in Australia and thinking about what it means for your son losing the language. I think that was quite an interesting moment. Whereas your work has remained, I guess, quite committed to telling that story. And I wondered if you could talk a bit more about what that idea of storytelling, starting with your own experience of the Shahnameh and this story being, somehow I guess this idea that there was a continuity and that continuity being broken, what that means.
I think the story that I'm dealing with is an ongoing story. With the recent flow of the refugees into Australia or into European countries, you could see there's a lot of, you could actually see there's this line of otherness. The Europeans were telling that this is us and these are the refugees, and this is for the Europeans, these facilities, and this is for the refugees. And then during that flow of the refugees, you could actually hear about the borders or the boundaries very often. And same was happening in Australia, when there was this invisible line of the otherness. The government, there's only 2% of the refugees or the immigrants of Australia are coming by boat, and the rest 98%, mostly backpackers or the other business. But in the government, the story of the refugees, only this 2% is really, really big, really huge. And in the news, you could see that if a refugee is going to the school and then joining army, it's a big, big news in Australia, saying that, the first ever Afghan descended female into the Australian army. So you could see that the first ever Afghan or Hazara, crossed the line of otherness and went into the Australian National Army. So that line is always there, and then in that line we have to sacrifice through a lot of other cultural values. The person, in order to go to the army or to the other national institutions, has to speak very fluently English, and then the person has to speak that English or practice that English at home. And in order to practice that English at home, has to stop speaking Hazaragi and stop practicing their own cultural or traditional values. So, becoming Australian is a big challenge. And you could see there's mostly, lots of these immigrants, they have lost their languages now. If you ask them to count in their own language, 1 to 10, they're not able to do that. The new generation is just vanishing. Yeah.
Should we open up to questions from the floor? Perhaps we could get an indication of how much time we have. $15 minutes, okay. If you could raise your hand, there's a question here, and just wait for the mic.
It's working? Okay. Joe, I just wanted to, if you could comment on your performance, which I'll just narrate a little bit what my experience was, and if you could just respond to that. When I first saw you starting to perform and the finger gestures over the face, I experienced this alienation from the human form. It seemed to be, to me, it was a feeling of alienation, a feeling of almost dehumanization that was going on as you added what seemed to be like a mask of fingers to yourself. And then this went on, and then there was various permutations and transformations, and then you left off the stage, and then you started interacting with us in the audience. And to me, there was a beautiful moment where you connected with the first participant, and then you created the gesture with the mask, and then the person responded. And this went on a number of different times. And at that point, we all got in touch with ourselves, mirroring you, and we realized that what you were doing was something that we could do ourselves. And by doing that, all of a sudden the alienation disappeared, and there was a very profound connection that was happening. And I felt like if it went on for another 15 minutes or an hour, that we would stop mirroring you, okay, because that's the initial instinct, is to just mirror you and create that connection, and we would start responding to you. And somewhere in that would be the origins of some kind of ritual of engagement. would be born out of that. So I just wanted to ask you just to respond. Is this the kind of response that you're getting in other performances and in different contexts, or does it depend upon the context what kind of response you get?
Yeah, thanks for your comment. Most of my performance, I need the audience participatory, yeah. So, and yeah, I don't like to perform only alone, and then, yeah, sometimes I did in front of the audience, and then later on I join to the audience to take part in my performance. So, yeah, there's so many the positions. So some position should like the mask. So some position have the like pointing the can on your head, and yeah, so they have like too many 108 position. Yeah, so how can I say that? Yeah, like I try to make the blur between the audience and the performer. Yeah, actually, I don't like to perform on the stage. Yeah, so because this is or you have to do it here. Yeah, so because I also not like to make like black balls or yeah. So normally I perform in the gallery or in the park. Yeah, so because I not feel comfortable to inside the full wall on around there, and yeah. So that's why even I perform on the stage, I jump off from the stage and then reach to the audience to make it you not really see, and you also like join in my piece, and yeah, so on. Yeah.
More questions? You can have both. Just here in the front.
Hi, thanks everyone, and of course the phenomenal presenters, Sparks of Light up on stage. Thank you for your presentations. I just wanted to take a minute and, give you the title of this section, which I called Pendulums, Swings, and Spheres of Influence. I hope that's something that can help us position even Alexis Destup's presentation in the context of what was sort of gathered here. Because when the question of choreography and bodies was raised, I felt like that, Alexis, you missed that a bit. Because you immediately went to the body as the body of humans. And in fact, you are really actually also dealing with bodies, large bodies of landscapes. And while humans are, you've taken humans out, it's not necessarily just an artistic choice. And these places are mostly abandoned sites, right? Or they're very difficult places for anyone to just go. From the stories that I hear from you, to access a lot of these sites, you really have to go through so many loops and hoops to get to these places. And they're very hermetic. So I just wanted to contextualize the trauma that we were all dealing with here, the trauma of humanity, the trauma of the psychic being, the trauma of landscape, and of course the trauma of the collective, the tribe. And how all of this, in a way, is part of the yin and yang. And these are very real forces. And somehow, when all of you take the work on, it's not necessarily just the doomsday story that comes out. In fact, it is the, atomic love. Who knew? What is that? And it's that, again, the taking away the semantics and allowing us to express and bring in all sides of what is happening. On the one hand, there's some serious drama unfolding over and over and over again in the landscape of the world. But on the other hand, there is other forces at play, and those forces being you, finding ways of taking this content and material and creating something out of it that is called consciousness. So I guess one question I did want to bring out here is, the panel is, because it could end up being on just on this tilted side. Maybe what's the other side, the pendulum swing? What is on the other side for you? What do you encounter that is still positive?
Can I go? Well, thanks for pointing out that it's a bit of a specific area, first and foremost, where the work is produced. It's not abandoned, but it's very severely restricted. It's industrial and military stuff. Yeah, it's just, and in that sense, I mean, I am quite drawn to dystopian places. That's one of them. But the pendulum, look, I went out there because there's really contradicting narratives acting upon that region. On the one hand, I was interested in a region that was directly experiencing climate change and directly experiencing the effects of climate change. But directly linked to that is a sort of whole economic narrative about, like future developments, thanks to the ice-free seas. I went there thinking that it was a sort of a future prospect, sort of something for the future. When I went there, I figured out that it was already pretty much enacted and happening. So I think I basically in my trajectory for that project, every time I went back, things were kind of ahead of, my wildest imagination. So it's a place where the reality of the place has always overtaken me. On the other hand, it's certainly, I wouldn't say that it's only doomy, and the work is pretty doomy, and no, that's not what it is. It is also a place of marvel and incredible beauty, and so there is a whole element in that region that I have not yet addressed with this work, which is really the object of a next work dealing with the same area. But there is an indigenous culture there, which is still pretty alive, which is the Sami culture, sort of descendant from the Mongolian shamanic cultures. And yeah, so I've been lucky enough to, after I produced this, to be sort of, introduced and invited and had sort of, and so these are, of course, which means that I managed to connect to stories that are very old, that are very deep, and that are still alive. That's just for one of the aspects of what lies beyond the pendulum. And I think what you can see is that there is a tremendous accumulation of the forces of modernity that have acted upon that region. And that is a very recent story. And these are the obvious traces. I mean, it's that kind of archaeology that I've been sort of delving for in that project. But there is something completely, it gets dwarfed by the elements, it gets dwarfed by the landscapes, it gets even the titanic sort of undertakings, which are truly just like mind-boggling, are still kind of, there's still sort of minute sort of interventions. So.
Thank you. Somebody else would like to respond as well? The other side of the pendulum,
I feel like your question is implying that we were too bleak, that somehow we presented a bad episode of Black Mirror, and I hope that's not what.
No, but I think that the tendency can be of the reading of it because it has an emotional impact on us. As you know, every one of them was full of emotion. And I think when we're not really very well trained when it comes to the emotional world, and that can take us just to the one side. So I thought it was important to bring out all the aspect of the brilliant possibilities that just is allowing you to also interact with this technology and these manipulations, and because there's again two sides. It could be manipulated in multiple ways, and I feel like you, of all people, would have access to seeing both sides, right?
Well, I guess I concentrate too much on the atomically explosive rather than the love. But I guess the love aspect is in the craftsmanship and the archival research. That's the love in the process. And the Birzada Abdul Wahid is referring to my maternal grandfather. So I've used his materials and analyzed his analog photography archive. But then also looking at it through kind of a critical distance and seeing the material for what it is, these beautiful analog prints of flora and fauna that are heavily politically embedded into a nationalist vision. And the way he showed in cultural institutes in Pakistan, perpetuating a certain kind of, so it's also kind of beyond the image itself. So I think it kind of goes hand in hand in creation. There is destruction, and destruction there is creation. So the yin and yang.
Any more questions from the floor? Show of hands.
Well, we can all continue. We all, I think, need a little break. We have 15 minutes, but I promise you after this last session, which is going to be phenomenal, please come back on time. We have a great reception for everyone, not just the presenters. We can go into the two pop-up spaces, 46 and 47, right here across the yard, and we will have some food and refreshments. But during the break, just take a quick break and come back, please. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Love is